Welcome to Interesting People. My name's Tom Lorentzen, and I'm the host of this show that is filmed under the auspices of the Chabot Las Positas Community College District here in Hayward, California. In a couple of prior interviews, I had the opportunity to interview Byron Williams, who is a good, objective, and fair columnist, a little bit liberal in his perspective for the Bay Area News Group. And then through two other interviews with Sander Van Oker, one of the most noted television journalists of our time. Today, I have a unique opportunity to have a good friend on, Debra Saunders, who is a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle and syndicated nationally. She has also written for the Wall Street Journal and for the Weekly Standard and National Review. Welcome to the show, Debra.
Hey, Tom.
Now, you just passed 20 years with the San Francisco Chronicle, correct? Congratulations on that.
I started when I was 7.
I remember, yes. Debra, just briefly a little bit. You were born in Massachusetts, as I understand. You went to school there and college there? Or?
I was born in Massachusetts, and I was a Republican in Massachusetts, which sort of set me up to be a Republican in San Francisco. It's kismet. I don't know what it is. I went to school at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, majored in Greek and Latin. I worked my way through college, I never took a journalism class, by the way. I should probably say that straight off. So anybody who's thinking of it, I am the wrong example to follow if you want to get into journalism.
Interesting. Greek and Latin, how did that ever lead into politics and then later to journalism?
Well, I mentioned that I worked my way through school. I started going when I was about 21. I'd worked as a waitress and as a secretary. And I got interested in Plato, and I thought, well, I'd like to read Plato in Greek. Well, the truth is, the beauty of reading Greek isn't Plato. It's Sophocles or some of the other folks. I mean, actually, it didn't work so well. But and I figured if I'm going to learn Greek, I might as well learn Latin. And I think it gives you a really good cultural rooting. It teaches you so much about language when you know Greek and Latin. You understand the grammar, the structure, how words have changed over time. And I thought at the time I'd probably want to go to law school, but I really love studying classics. I got to read so many great works that it just didn't translate into that. By the time I graduated, I was selling insurance to work my way through college. I sold group insurance to hospitals, and then I went to work for this man named Arnold Zanker. He had this business where he trained people how to be in the media. And while I worked for him, I was a Republican, and I thought, I'm going to find a Republican candidate for Arnold Zanker to work with. Found a man named Ray Shammy, who ran for U.S. Senate against Ted Kennedy, and he also ran against John Kerry and lost. That's when John Kerry became a senator. And I really enjoyed working on the Shammy campaign. His consultant, Todd Domke, thought I did good work and hired me, and that's how I got into politics. And from politics, I went to journalism.
Now, Greek and Latin, that's an unusual background for somebody that ends up in the political world and journalism. Do you think that's had impact on how you view things politically and journalistically?
Well, I often see a similarity between Rome and in America. I mean, you certainly, historically, you see that. I just think having read Greek and Latin makes me a better writer, makes me understand the things that you can do with words and sentence structure and how grammar is something that you can use to make a more persuasive argument. And I've read some of the greatest writers and read them. I mean, the great thing about studying classics is that you read something word by word. You don't just read something over the weekend. You talk about every line of something. When you read Homer, you talk about every line in Homer. Tacitus, I love Tacitus. I recommend Tacitus to anybody who wants to read it and read him. And at any rate, I mean, you're just exposed to writers who they got everything that they could into a sentence or a poem.
Is there anybody that has written like that in modern times that has influenced upon you as well?
Well, I mean, look at there are a lot of writers who. Raymond Chandler was someone who followed that stuff. I mean, there are a lot of people who I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you, Tom. Sorry.
Okay. You became a Republican and conservative, so to speak. How'd you end up becoming a Republican, and how would you define yourself as a conservative?
Well, the first time that I registered to vote, I registered as a Democrat. And I mentioned I worked my way through school. I worked for a state department, was one of my first jobs. And I noticed that when the Boston Globe Spotlight, which was this investigative team, was working, you couldn't get on an elevator at 5 o'clock. You had to wait for a few of them. But when the Spotlight team wasn't out, it didn't quite work that way. And I sort of came to see government as something that does a lot of good things. I have a lot of friends who've worked in government. I've worked in government, actually. I worked for the California legislature. But also, it can't do everything well. And the more it tries to do, the less well it does those things. And that's the kind of conservative I am.
That's interesting. I remember reading Russell Kirk became conservative out of a thoughtful approach regarding concern over bigness, big business, big government, big unions, and it sounds like you came in through a similar approach, philosophical and thoughtful to this approach. And
yeah, I think so. And I have to say, you know, as you watch how things evolve, you see how, you know, it's really funny. I recently wrote a column about a bill in the legislature to pre-register 15-year-olds to vote. When they go to the DMV, they can pre-register. Well, why do we do that? Why would anyone propose that? I talked to a couple people, and I was told, well, you know, 18-year-olds aren't registering. Why aren't they registering? They can and you can pre-register when you're 17. There's a law that said that they can try to push voter involvement in high school. So every time something doesn't work, what do? We try to do more of it. So if you can't get 18-year-olds to register to vote, why then you ratchet it down and you make something earlier. So you're getting, somehow, instead of trying to do a few things well, they just get, the mandate keeps broadening and things are done less well. So that's definitely kept me a conservative.
Mm-hmm. With your interest in language and semantics, the terms that we use to sort of govern a lot of our discussions politically in this country are liberal and conservative, moderate in the middle. How do you view these terms and their relevance to today, conservative? Why don't you start with what is a conservative in your mind?
Well, you know, a lot of people have different views of what a conservative is. I believe that we should have a strong foreign policy, good national security. I think that's one of the things that government should do, the federal government should do. You want to have good services for people, good schools, you want to have good police, and you want to have things like that. I think liberalism is a philosophy that really wants government to do more and more things for people. Conservatives want people to try to do more for themselves, and liberals want the government to be more and more of a guiding hand. That pre-registering 15-year-olds, the philosophy is that we have to guide people to vote. We have to help them decide that they want to vote. And what's a moderate? You know, the definition of a moderate, I think, has changed over time. On the one hand, you could be somebody who is liberal on some issues and conservative on other issues, and that would make you a moderate. Some people would say that makes you squishy and not is if you don't stand for something. But I think the way I'd use the term now is you're a moderate if you believe in working with the other side now. The left, and there are so many people on the far left, and they never get called out. I mean, everything is always far right Republicans. We never hear people talking about far left liberals, and yet there are so many of them. And on the right, I would consider somebody to be far right, not necessarily because of their personal philosophy, but whether or not they feel that they should work with the other side. We don't see enough of that these days, as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. And this is a democracy. You have to respect the fact that there are people with other views if you want to get things done.
How did you start your career in journalism? What was your first job?
Okay, so I mentioned that I worked in politics, and while I worked in politics, I worked with someone who had a freelance piece that was published in the Wall Street Journal. And I thought, if that blankety blank can get in the Wall Street Journal, I can too. And I'd always sort of thought, gee, maybe someday I'd like to write a column, but I had no idea how I'd get there. And when this happened, I thought, I'm going to start sending out my stuff freelance. And I, at this point in time, I'm working at Russo, Watson, Rollins, you know Sal Russo, Ed Rollins, in Sacramento. And I sent my first piece out to the Boston Herald. It was called Take a Republican to Lunch. And it was about how so many people in Boston, which I'd left Boston for Sacramento, how so many of them didn't even know any Republicans and they ought to expose themselves to other points of view. And so that was the first piece. I got a few other pieces placed. I got in the Sacramento Bee. I was in the San Francisco Chronicle when I worked in the legislature. And I wasn't a great political operative. I didn't look like a Republican, I was often told. I was, a lot of the women in politics then were in fundraising, and I was pretty aggressive, and it wasn't a great fit. So I started looking around in journalism. I thought, I should try. And it just so happened that the LA Daily News was looking for an editorial writer. They wanted to get somebody female. They wanted to get someone conservative, and I fit the bill. I went down and I interviewed. I'd had, a number of freelance pieces, and they hired me to write editorials. I got a column, weekly column. Actually, it started out bi-weekly, turned to weekly, turned to semi-weekly. And I worked there for 4.5 years. One day, I met my husband in 1992. We were married in 1992, we met before then. And shortly after we got married, there were the LA riots. It was awful, it was terrible. And then one day, I got a phone call from Bill German, the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, and he invited me up for an interview, and it was a day-long interview. And 21 almost years later, here I am.
Well, that's quite a story. In talking about Watts, why don't we just deviate for a minute on that? You were living in Los Angeles at that time, and you covered it. Looking back, what views do you have on that whole tragic experience? And
well, it's interesting how you perceive something at the time. The Rodney King case, I saw the TV broadcast, the news broadcast, where they first showed that tape, and I was just shocked at the treatment, the way the police treated him. Of course, then you had the trial in Simi Valley. People, by the way, Simi Valley people hate when you say Simi Valley jury. It was a Ventura County jury in Simi Valley, and when that verdict came down, I remember just being blown away, watching on television as people started to riot, and not really thinking what would one do. I mean, a lot of people afterward were highly critical of the police for Daryl Gates, remember Chief Daryl Gates,
Sure.
for not really moving in sooner, and they were right. But I think at the time, people were paralyzed and really not quite sure how to deal with it. It was an ugly moment, and really sad to see all the buildings that were torched in South Central, and not just there. I mean, the Daily News is in Woodland Hills, which is the western part of the San Fernando Valley, and the violence didn't hit Woodland Hills, but it did hit the East San Fernando Valley, and it was scary.
20 years later, looking back on that, have things improved, conditions and racial relations and economic conditions that helped to foster that tragic situation? Have things improved much at all, do you feel?
Well, I do think that that law enforcement try to be more, for one thing, one thing that's changed things is people have cameras now, so they can videotape everything. And I know a number of people in law enforcement. I consider them to be sensitive human beings who are racially sensitive, but we still see things. I mean, it's a messy world out there. Look at Oscar Grant, and that. I mean, what a horrible event that was. That And so while I think that things have improved, I can tell you there are a number of kids who would be watching this who think, no, things haven't improved. And I wish we'd come further than we have.
Well, I'm old enough where I can remember the riots in 1965 as well in Los Angeles, Detroit, and the evolution of this all these years, and then how with the Rodney King matter and his great line, "Why can't we all get along?" was, I think, one of the most quoted statements of the last 25, 50 years. And going to come back to that a little bit later when we get into politics about why can't Republicans and Democrats, conservative, liberal, get along a little bit better. But what we're going to do is during the more than 20 years now you've been with the Chronicle, you've written about local matters in San Francisco and the Bay Area, you've written about state matters, you've written about national matters, and indeed international matters. So we're going to sort of break that up and talk about local matters to begin with, and then segue a little bit later into state subjects, and then into federal and national issues. I also want to acknowledge your husband, Wesley Smith, who's been a good friend. He is a very noted writer on bioethics and with the Discovery Institute, Wesley J. Smith, and I forgot to mention that a little bit earlier. That was my apology on that. Being a conservative, then, how do you find it working in a Boston and New York, or Boston and San Francisco are considered probably the two most liberal cities in the country? How have you found being a conservative, writing for a paper that's in the heart of one of the most liberal cities in the country? What's been your experiences on this?
Well, obviously there are days it's no fun. It's no fun walking through the newsroom like after Dick Cheney shoots somebody in a hunting accident. It's no fun walking through the newsroom. But on the other hand, you know, things change over time, and I'm just astonished at how many, and grateful at how many people on the left are glad to have a conservative writing for the Chronicle. So while there are people who think, oh, you're conservative, you're evil, you're bad, and can't really get beyond that, there are so many people who are newspaper readers who really engage with the Chronicle, like having a bit of a back and forth. And you know, they think sometimes they get sick of only hearing liberal opinions, and they're glad to have somebody else with a different voice challenging sort of the orthodoxy of city politics and in California politics in general. So on the one hand, it sometimes one feels like Sisyphus, if I may go to Greek mythology, who keeps pushing that stone up to the top of the hill, and just as he gets near the top, it starts to roll down. I don't see the San Francisco or the Bay Area as ever being conservative in my lifetime again, you know, ever being conservative again, certainly not in my lifetime. In California, probably not, but it's a big world and there's room for all sorts of opinions in it.
What do you find most interesting about covering politics here in the San Francisco Bay Area? Is there anything that really stands out that you find interesting compared to other parts of the country?
It's a big world and there's room for all sorts of opinions in it.
What do you find most interesting about covering politics here in the San Francisco Bay Area? Is there anything that really stands out that you find interesting compared to other parts of the country?
Well, I've covered politics in Los Angeles and San Francisco. I mean, I've been to other cities and seen what happens. San Francisco, sometimes people in politics don't have much of a sense of humor
Really?
About San Francisco. LA has a great sense of humor about itself that you don't see. And let's face it, I mean, San Francisco's cutting edge. Well, California politicians, I mean, liberal politicians, they love to say this is the first in the nation. So they're always coming up, and there's a certain, you know, there's that odd nanny element to San Francisco politics, where on the one hand, well, let me give you a great example. The naked guys in San Francisco. Now, it's sort of interesting that San Francisco hadn't banned public nudity. Berkeley banned public nudity, and San Francisco wouldn't do it. There's a supervisor named Scott Wiener. He's the supervisor for the Castro. And he started, there were just so many naked guys hanging out at Jane Warner Plaza, and finally got to the point where people were getting sick of it. I mean, there have been times when I've been in San Francisco, friends visiting, and you'll see a group of naked guys ride by on their bikes or walking down the street. And some people think it's funny, and certainly many tourists will walk up to get their pictures taken with these folks. But it may not be something you want to see every day. The place where the naked guys like to congregate in the Castro, it's a couple, 3 blocks from an elementary school, and people were getting sick of it. Scott Wiener comes out with a bill where he basically required that they put, I'll show you, something underneath their derrieres so that for hygiene purposes. And that was something that I remember talking to him at the time and saying, why don't you just ban public nudity? Doesn't that make sense? And he was hesitant to do so because who wants to push that in San Francisco? It's a tolerant city. We look away. And what about the Folsom Street Fair? There's been nudity there. We don't want to start telling people what to do with their personal or sexual lives. So I remember I was a questioner in mayoral debate, and I asked all the candidates, would you support a ban on nudity? And the only candidate who said yes was a woman who was a Green, who wasn't even invited to the debate, who crashed it. She was great. And but it's just sort of astonishing to me that that happened. Now, last year, the Board of Supervisors, by a narrow margin, passed a ban on nudity. But the fact that you would have that much hand-wringing on something like that, hand-wringing on something like that, it's just amazing that that would happen. And of course, you've heard the expression, only in San Francisco or only in California. Well, we have a lot of those moments.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, the Green candidate strikes me odd. I remember Kermit the Frog said it's not easy being green, so maybe she had some empathy there.
That's right. She was the only woman, too. No, I'm sorry, there was one other. I apologize. I'm wrong.
Now, you've covered several mayors, too. What views do you have looking back on the career of Willie Brown as mayor of San Francisco? How do you view Mayor Brown?
Well, Willie Brown was certainly had a flair for being mayor, and he enjoyed that job tremendously. I think he didn't wield as much power as he did when he was the Assembly Speaker, but he certainly enjoyed himself. The homeless situation didn't get better under Willie Brown. He promised to fix Muni in 100 days. He didn't. But whatever he did, whatever he said and however he appeared, he always had a certain flair and style about him. And that's a lot of what San Franciscans are looking for in a politician. They get it with him.
Mm-hmm. Gavin Newsom.
And by the way, he's a good columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle now. Writes a fun yarn every Sunday.
Yes, and does good commentaries, too.
Yes, he does.
Gavin Newsom, he's now Lieutenant Governor. What do you make of his tenure as mayor of San Francisco?
Gavin Newsom is interesting. He is very much of a policy wonk. And when he would come in for the ed boards, he would just rattle off all sorts of things on the budget, all sorts of initiatives. He really enjoyed being mayor. As you may recall, he ran for governor in 2010, but that didn't last. And so he realized he was going to lose the primary to Jerry Brown, and he made this quick switch to lieutenant governor. Tom, this is a job that does not suit Gavin Newsom. Well, for one thing, we know that it challenges him so little that he became a host for Current TV for a while. Had his own TV show. I guess we're paying his salary and he still has time to do other things. But also, he doesn't get along very well with Jerry Brown. And that's become pretty clear. He came into the Chronicle for an ed board one day and said that he wanted to see the two offices bracketed. That means that instead of having a lieutenant governor running separately from governor, they'd be on the same ticket. And he seemed to be saying, well, gee, if we were on the same ticket, we'd get along better. Well, you're sort of announcing you don't get along very well with Jerry Brown, and that's not a politic thing to do if you're trying to work better with the governor. So I assume Jerry Brown will run for re-election. And I don't know what Gavin Newsom does in the meantime. I guess he keeps a close eye on Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer to see what they're going to do.
Probably so. Mayor Lee, what's your view on how he's doing as mayor of San Francisco?
Ed Lee, people consider Ed Lee to be a good government kind of guy, but that's an image that's been tarnished from the beginning. As you may recall, when Gavin Newsom named him, when he was to fill in for him for that last year, Ed Lee said he wouldn't run for mayor. Then he did. People just talked him into it, and since he's been mayor, I think he's had problems with his housing director who just resigned. Not only was this a problematic hire, but also the mayor's office had different stories about what the mayor thought about him and knew about him. And I think the other issue, and I've certainly been on the other side of this issue, is Sheriff Ross Margarimi. On New Year's Eve, a little over a year ago, Ross Margarimi and his wife, Eliana Lopez, had a fight, and it was in the afternoon, and he bruised her arm. She went to a neighbor, and that neighbor, and she said, he's done this to me, he's done it before. The friend basically called the police, asking them about what to do about a domestic violence case. They ended up getting involved, and in the end, the district attorney filed 3 charges related to domestic violence against Ross Margarimi. He hadn't even been sworn in yet as sheriff. So basically, the mayor threw the book at Ross Margarimi, and I think most San Franciscans were with the mayor on this. The mayor decided that he wanted to fire Margarimi for official misconduct. Again, I think that the majority of San Franciscans probably agreed with that, but he really overplayed the hand on that. It wasn't enough to say, which he could have, you bruised your wife's arm, and the mayor called him a wife beater. That's it, you can't be sheriff. But he also threw in all this stuff about cover-up and things that couldn't be proven. That made the City Ethics Commission investigation last forever, and it cost a lot of money for taxpayers. I think that sort of tarnished his good government image.
One more question, then we're going to take a break for a public service announcement. You lived in Oakland, you and your husband Wesley, for a number of years. Oakland's dealing with a lot of troubled issues, particularly the crime rate. What's your views on Oakland and where they're at and the leadership there, or the lack thereof?
I think Jean Quan has not been a strong mayor, and she's sort of the how not to example for ranked choice voting, which is how she got elected. She just doesn't seem to understand what needs to be done to deal with the crime problem in Oakland, and it's just tremendous. I mean, first she really flubbed the whole Occupy Oakland problem, which brought, a massive amount of people around City Hall, and it just costs the city a lot of money and a lot of goodwill. And now you've got these horrible shootings in Oakland. I mean, it's not the first time. And she just doesn't seem to understand. She just doesn't seem to understand how much we need to have a police-centric reaction to this. Jerry Brown, when he was mayor of Oakland, had a better understanding of that.
With that, we're going to take a pause here for a public service announcement and be back in just a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.
Turning a 20-foot wall into a canvas takes vision. So will getting into college. I've got what it takes. So do you.
In California, visit knowhowtogocalifornia.org.
Welcome back to Interesting People. My name's Tom Lorentzen, the host of the show, and today my guest is Debra Saunders, a longtime columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle and syndicated nationally as well. Debra, we're going to move on to some state politics here in California now, and you've covered 5 governors, right? Starting with Duke Machian. Mm-hmm. Could you just give a little snapshot of your view of the performance of each of these 5 governors, starting with Governor Deukmejian.
Well, they sure show how the state has changed, don't they?
Sure.
George Deukmejian was just, if I use the past tense, it's because of as governor, sweetest governor probably ever in a certain way. I remember this story that one of his aides told me about, the thing about George Deukmejian is when the salary he made as governor, he was ecstatic. Probably like, Jerry Brown's, I think it's something in common with that too. He was the Attorney General, Republican Attorney General, then governor, and he was just not somebody who really threw his weight around with his position. An aide told me about the time that he brought a slide projector out to his house, and the governor said, "I don't want to put you out." And I'm sorry, I can't imagine any of his successors being that way. He was tough about spending. He made sure that when the state spent too much, that taxpayers got the money back and it didn't go toward growing governor. I think he was a good steward. Then came Pete Wilson, former senator, former San Diego mayor. And, it's interesting. A lot of people look back at Pete Wilson as the last governor who knew how to deal, because when he came in, he realized that the state had huge budget problems. It had a $14 billion shortfall, which is almost quaint now, right? And he basically decided the way we're going to deal with it is half spending cuts, half tax increases. Republicans in the legislature tried to stop him. And he went to meet with some of them in Tahoe. They were having a retreat that weekend. And he said, "You've got a choice. Do you want to be, let me see, what's the way to put it? Flipping, irrelevant, or not?" And he really pushed for, so he kept, I think he really kept state, and from then on, he worked his best to get state finances in order. And of course, I miss him because he's the last Republican governor we had, and always, I've had better access with Republicans than Democrats. Then came Gray Davis, and Gray Davis, of course, is the governor who was recalled. I'm sorry, I should mention Arnold Schwarzenegger was a Republican after Pete Wilson. Sort of. Anyway, it just seems a little different. But then there was Gray Davis, and Gray Davis won re-election. So he was elected twice, but he was the victim, and I think Jerry Brown is very aware of this, of the Democratic Party's success, because the legislature was very far to the left, and they kept pushing him to do things. They pushed him so that he raised the vehicle license fee, also known as the car tax, and that infuriated voters. They pushed him to sign a bill to allow illegal immigrants to get driver's licenses, which they hadn't been able to do for a number of years. And it wasn't just that they pushed for that bill, they pushed for the most the worst bill possible that way. Nothing to increase penalties for people who drove without a license. None of the things that you'd expect. No background checks, nothing in it. And those two things were death to Gray Davis. When the VLF went up, it tripled, and that bill passed, that's what led to the recall, and that's what led to the demise of Gray Davis. Now, of course, he's a hero. I mean, in fact, I saw him at Charlotte at the Democratic convention, and he's sort of become this cult hero for Democrats because of what happened to him. But he was a pretty moderate Democrat who tried to keep the legislature in check and failed, and he paid a mighty price for it. He was followed, of course, by Arnold Schwarzenegger, and one of the first things that happened when Arnold got in is he got rid of the VLF hike, the vehicle license fee hike, and the legislature actually rescinded the driver's license bill, and under the dubious claim that Arnold had agreed to sign a better one, which didn't happen. And so I know that there are people associated with Gray Davis who felt that here these guys, they pushed him to do something that forfeited his job, but they didn't do that themselves. And Arnold Schwarzenegger tried to be a good governor, but he took over. There had been a big spending spree under Davis, and he never quite balanced the books the way he wanted to. And he borrowed money. He got this bond measure passed, and he tried to do too much because when he couldn't get the legislature to do what he wanted, he put 3 measures on the ballot. There was a 4th measure, and it's just fascinating to me to watch how things can change in California. The voters rejected those 3 measures, and basically Arnold emerged after that and said, I've learned my lesson. The voters of California want me to do my job. I find this fascinating because what is Jerry Brown, and the message was, wait a minute, we had a governor's election in 2002, a recall in 2003, we don't want to have to keep voting on everything. And what does Jerry Brown do? He gets elected governor and he puts a ballot measure to fix the budget before the voters, and it passes. So it just shows that if you if you find the right moment to do something, it can happen. Arnold should have tried harder to get some of the stuff done that he did, but when he tried to work with he was tough with Democrats at first. And then he tried very hard to work with them and succeeded in working with the Democrats, I think, pretty well. He left office in a very poor way by commuting the sentence of the former speaker, Fabian Nunez, the son of his son, who was involved in a manslaughter charge. And that's just something, I don't see him, that's something that sort of tainted I'd have much fonder memories about it. I mean, it was great when he was first elected. He came out there and he said he was going to blow up the boxes. I got an interview with him. It was so much fun. I got to wield the savage sword of Conan. That never happened when Gray Davis was governor. And he brought us a real, he brought a real appeal to the horseshoe, which is what they call the governor's office. But it just didn't. He couldn't live up to that big box office. Who could, right?
Well, that leads us to 2010, and Jerry Brown came back. He ran against Meg Whitman, and what your views looking at that election? What happened, and how is Governor Brown now doing?
Well, Jerry Brown ran a brilliant campaign, and people were thinking that he was crazy. He didn't want to spend a lot of money in the primary. Meg Whitman was spending so much money. The Republican, she ended up becoming the Republican nominee for governor. She was at the she's now at Hewlett Packard but she was at the time known as the former eBay CEO. And I have to say, if you want to know what happened with Mitt Romney, look at Meg Whitman. She spent a lot of money, and it just didn't work with voters. I think that they didn't want to see a moneybags candidate walk into the governor's seat, and she never really got the traction that she needed to win. Jerry Brown just played this great cheapskate shtick, said he would only raise taxes if the voters wanted him to. He came into the Chronicle for an editorial board meeting when he was running with this big, thick binder, and he said, "These are all my notes for what I'm going to do for the state budget when I'm elected." I said, "Well, what's in it?" "Well, I'm not going to tell you." You're not going to tell us? You're coming into a newspaper with your plan and you won't tell us what it is? And I was not amused, and I wrote so at the time, and I still think it, but I have to say, as I look back, that he was somebody who could get away with doing that sort of thing.
Interesting. With the population base of California is in Southern California, Los Angeles, San Diego, and yet all the state constitutional officers are from San Francisco and the Bay Area. How did this happen?
Well, Tom, I think part of it was that Antonio Villaraigosa, the Los Angeles mayor, couldn't really win the governorship and understood it. He might have changed that dynamic. But it shows that this is a far left state. It's not a liberal state, it's a far left state. And so who do you have in office? It's not just Jerry Brown, who is pretty liberal for all of his feints at being a conservative. But you also have Kamala Harris, who was the DA of San Francisco. Well, that's not a law and order position if it's when you say of San Francisco. And she had been behind a number of policies that you would not consider to be tough law enforcement. Steve Cooley, the Republican district attorney of Los Angeles, came close to beating her. That was the only close race. And then you have Gavin Newsom. I mean, it is sort of astonishing. But I think that the more liberal you are, the more likely you are to win a primary in California, and that the powerhouse from the Bay Area reflects that.
Mm-hmm. Proposition 30 passed in the last election, so are we, and things are looking a little better in Sacramento for the first time in 10, 15 years. Are we financially stable now, or are we getting there?
Well, we're in much better footing, but it's interesting. Remember, the tax hikes in this are the longest one's 7 years. So these are all supposed to be temporary tax increases. That's no way to, so here's the problem for Jerry Brown, and he's got to be thinking about Gray Davis every minute. You've got, Democrats are going to hold over the next 2 years a supermajority in both the Assembly and the Senate. Not every minute, because there are all these special elections. It's a game of musical chairs where there's a seat vacated and everyone runs for it. But they're going to really want to spend a lot of money. And there's no longer, there are no longer enough Republicans to stop them, because that 2/3 vote threshold, which had allowed Republicans to stop tax hikes in the past, that's not going to hold over the next 2 years. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on Jerry Brown to spend more money, to raise more taxes, and that's what happened, what we saw with Gray Davis, we're going to see happening again, Tom.
Well, you just did a recent article called Governor Brown Does the Sacramento Choo-Choo, which I thought was an interesting title. And given those factors, supermajority for the Democrats in both houses of the legislature and state constitutional offices, is there a possibility Jerry Brown is going to become governor? No, as you raised, the possibility?
I mean, I think that's a real possibility, that he's going to go from being Governor Moonbeam, which is what Mike Royko called him a long time ago, to Governor No, because he's going to spend all of his time saying no to Democrats.
Mm-hmm. With the Democrats in such control of things, is there, what are the Republican Party, what can they do to become competitive again?
Well, they have to have good candidates, and we haven't always had good candidates, so that's one problem. The second thing is, sometimes time just changes things. I remember when Gray Davis was reelected, it looked as though things were over for Republicans, and guess what? There was a Republican governor not shortly thereafter. Look at this state has, every single statewide office is held by a Democrat. The two U.S. senators are Democrats, and you have supermajorities in the Assembly and the Senate. It's going to be tough. The Republican Party is going to have to stop relying, I think, on some of the money bag candidates that they've had, and we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Term limits, what's been the impact of that, pro and con, on the state of California?
I was a proponent of term limits, and I have to say, I'm not feeling so much that way these days. Part of it is that when I go to Sacramento, I don't recognize lawmakers as easily as I used to. I mean, for journalists who are, unless you're in Sacramento, it's just, you see this churn that's going on. The idea had been that that state lawmakers would do a better job if they didn't think that they own their seats for life. I don't think that we've necessarily seen that. On the other hand, we now have the top two primary where you can have a moderate and a liberal or a moderate and a conservative running against each other in a district, so that's a good thing. Yeah.
We're going to take a short pause now for a public service announcement, and then come back and talk about national and perhaps international issues as well. Thank you.
This is one amazing truffula tree. Can you imagine a place where these grow everywhere? Yes, it's called the forest, a magical place to enjoy with your family. Ooh. So discover the forest and explore all the wonder that's there. Visit discovertheforest.org to find a forest near you.
My name's Tom Lorentzen. I'm the host of the show. And today my guest is Debra Saunders, a nationally syndicated columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. We were talking about San Francisco and Bay Area issues earlier and state issues. Now we're going to move on to national and federal issues, Debra. To start off, we're going to just ask you to give you some comments on the 2008 presidential election. John McCain and Barack Obama running against each other. Looking back at the election, what are your views on that?
So I've been covering presidential elections since 1988. I met you, Tom, in Houston at the Republican Convention in 1992. I have to say, I think 2008 was the best year ever for a political campaign. There were so many moving parts. It was such a fascinating race. For one thing, it was Hillary Clinton versus Barack Obama. And that was amazing to watch this newcomer who had spoken to the Democratic Convention in 2004 in Boston become the front runner and nominee in 2008. And he is first black president. Just on that level alone, it was historic. And it was that. So the primary was astonishing, watching this battle between the would-be first woman president versus Barack Obama, and all of the fighting with that. And that was a race that could have concluded earlier if Obama had won New Hampshire but didn't. And so that was a tough race. And then John McCain John McCain versus Barack Obama. That was fascinating. I remember being in Denver, watching that speech, and I'm horrible at the names of stadiums, but watching Barack Obama give that amazing speech in Denver, and the crowds were just completely energized. And then going off to fly to Minneapolis for the Republican convention, and out comes the word that Sarah Palin is going to be the running mate. And I'd sort of hoped that she would be his pick. I'd followed her as Alaska governor. And I thought she's like him in a lot of ways. She's a maverick. She can work across the aisle. And that was her reputation among those who knew about her in 2008. Things changed, of course. It was a tough race for her in that the trial by fire she received. So there, a lot of people hadn't put, in fact, a number of people had lists of who they thought would be the running mate for McCain, and Sarah Palin wasn't on their list. Well, we know what happens when the press don't think you're going to be on the list. They give you an extra dose of scrutiny. That's what happened to Dan Quayle in '88, and that's what happened to Sarah Palin. And then the rumors started coming out about her son and who whether or not the son was really her grandson. Just ridiculous, awful rumors of which people should be ashamed of repeating, and I just did so. But those rumors is not fact. It was just so horrible. And I think it sort of distorted her. I think if Sarah Palin had stayed in the Alaska governor's job for a few more years, that she would have had the seasoning that would have prepared her better than this. All of a sudden you're thrown out there and everyone's asking you questions about your family, very invasive questions. Questions no one was asking Joe Biden how he was, what was going to happen with his family, and so that's sort of a sad thing. But it was an amazing race, and just a great race to cover. 2012 wasn't as good.
Okay. Looking back at President Obama's first term, how do you assess that now? He's got 4 years behind him.
Well, I think his signal achievement, of course, was Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And I think that this president has made a number of miscalculations, but I don't think he would think of it that way. If he had looked at trying to get the economy moving first, if that had been his big priority, creating jobs, I think things would have been different for him. The Affordable Care Act, something that passed without any Republican votes on the floor, was incredibly divisive politically, and it just alienated a lot of employers and a lot of people who felt that this was a massive intrusion into something in which the federal government had not had such a big role. Certainly my view. But also, the president had promised that he was going to push a comprehensive immigration bill his first year, and he didn't do that. I sort of feel that I think the president feeds off of dysfunction and anger, and that you saw that in this campaign. That the fact, why didn't he push a comprehensive immigration reform bill? Well, because as it turns out, he got a bigger percentage of the Latino vote in 2012 than he did in 2008, even though he hadn't kept his promise. It seems as though sort of ginning up a sense of grievance among people has been part of the formula. The 2012 race was about peeling off little sections of voters, going for single women and different groups like that. And he's not been a unifying force in this country, which I find a disappointment. I knew that he was ideologically very liberal, but I thought he wanted to unite this country more than he did. I think that he has worked to divide people at times when he could have tried to bring people closer together.
Do you think he's more partisan than other presidents you've covered?
They're all partisan, Tom. Mm-hmm. The thing is that some of them feed off of it more than others. Look, they all want to win. They all want their parties to do better. They want to have a legacy. They want to look good in the history books. These are all things that that's they're politicians. That's Kennedy famously said all mothers want their children to be president, but none of them want them to become politicians in the process, and that's what they are.
You recently did a piece which I thought was interesting and generous in a way. 5 things to like about President Obama, coming from a good conservative writer. Can you remember all 5?
Well, I think he's a great role model. He's a good family man. He has an amazing wife, very accomplished. They work well as a team together. He seems like a great dad. I think it's wonderful that we have someone like that as president. As a human being, I respect him a great deal. He signed the Fair Sentencing Act. Now, that was an act that there's been a movement. There was a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, so that if you sold 5 grams of powder cocaine, which you got the same sentence as somebody who sold, no, it's 5 grams of crack, 500 grams of powder cocaine. Basically, it's something that I think punished. There are more black offenders on crack, and it's been an incredibly unfair law. It's amazing. Washington can pass a bad law like that. It was passed in the 90s, and it takes forever to fix it. So the Fair Sentencing Act didn't make it 0-to-0 disparity, but it reduced it to 18-to-1, and I think that was a good change. I support that he did that. He actually, I think that what he did with Secure Communities, which started out as a Bush program, was a smart way to deal with illegal immigration. Don't go after people. Under him, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has gone after people who broke other laws, and those are the people. The focus has been on deporting folks like that, not just anybody. So that's been a smart thing. And Guantanamo Bay is still there. Mm-hmm.
Charles Krathheimer and Brooke Shields in the New York Times recently wrote a piece.
David Shields.
Or David
Brooke.
David Brooke. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. Vulnerable towards the female side there.
Uh-huh.
But they wrote 2 different but thoughtful pieces regarding the way the budget is changing, particularly under President Obama, and referenced some European history, is that as we move further and further into the entitlement state, the welfare state, that we have to have far more substantial reductions in military spending. And with that can cause a major shift in the direction that the United States plays in the world affairs. Do you see that as something that's transpiring under President Obama, is this tilt in that direction?
I don't think there's any question about it. This whole what's going on with the budget right now, where we had the sequester deal. Please don't get mad at me for using that term, but you know, this president is pushing for huge cuts in defense, and while we can all find things in the military budget that would be considered extravagant and not good uses of taxpayer money, to think that we're still at war in Afghanistan. We have involvement in Libya. There's a war in Mali. We just had the attack in Algeria. The thought of trying to reduce the defense budget while there's so much going on in this world, I think that we're going to see that happen. Whether events in the world allow that to go as the president wants is another question, and that remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. With China and the increasing role they're playing in global affairs, recently apparently African leaders held a summit actually I believe in Beijing, and they're playing a more astute role as time goes on. And do you see a shift taking place where China might become more ambitious and aggressive, perhaps even in the militaries of the world?
Well, I think China already is ambitious and aggressive.
Okay.
So, but sure, there's a possibility of that. I mean, I at times wonder what the future of China will be, and I don't think it's certain whether or not the economic expansion that we've seen there is going to continue as it has or not. But I know one thing. I know that the Obama White House is focusing on China, and it's trying to move its push away from other theaters to China. That's where its focus is right now.
In your piece that you did on 5 positive things about President Obama, you gave him credit too for authorizing the military action to get bin Laden.
Absolutely, that's right. That was another one. Yes, that's a biggie.
And I'm just curious, do you recall anybody ever writing the 5 things that a liberal columnist, the 5 things I liked about George W. Bush?
Look, there's a double standard. We all know that Republicans have to try to get along with Democrats, and Democrats don't have to try to get along with Republicans. And by the way, you know, Tom, you introduced me as the San Francisco Chronicle columnist. I'm usually introduced as the conservative columnist. And I've said to people, well, do you ever introduce somebody as the liberal columnist? No, that's redundant, right? It's understood. So I can't think of that happening a whole lot. It's the world we live in.
You recently reviewed the movie, or saw it before it came out, Zero Dark 30, and then you did a column on that. And it's controversial. Senator Feinstein's been talking about having an investigation into leaks from the CIA, and et cetera. And there's concern over the use of waterboarding, et cetera, to get information out. And yet a recent piece, I think it was in Time magazine, Richard Stengel wrote a piece that President Obama has become perhaps the drone president. So now, perhaps in a way, and I think maybe you even wrote something on this, instead of using something like waterboarding, we're just killing people. Where do you see the president going in terms of his use of the military in these type of activities? And are we going into a brave new world now, or?
Yeah, the military, look at what happened in Libya. There were no boots on the ground. We used drones, and the use of drones helped overthrow Gaddafi. So I think you're going to see this president do it. I have to say, while I think the use of drones is smart, and I support it, the overuse of drones is a problem, and I know that the Pentagon has tried to reduce civilian casualties, and that they've really worked at refining that. This does not help our image. I mean, it just astonishes me that Barack Obama could run for president in 2008 saying that waterboarding in Guantanamo Bay was a recruiting tool for terrorists. And now he's the drone president, and we're using drones sort of liberally, one might say. And that's different somehow. To me, I mean, it's just complete hypocrisy, and that's a word I try not to use. But it's just astonishing that he can say that it's absolutely un-American for the CIA to use these enhanced techniques, but it's okay to kill people. we're going to do that. That's different. So.
Well, with that said, Deborah, we're going to wrap up this interview and this discussion.